Good evening and welcome to the Social Immune System, an Aletheia podcast. This evening we're going to be talking a little bit about Laura Ingalls Wilder because the PC authoritarians are attempting again to whitewash history. Today I have Kimberly Brown again because she knows quite a bit about this. And take it away.
Well, the decision has been made to strip Laura Ingalls Wilder's name from the book award created in her honor in 1954. It was given to her as a surprise in 1954 when she was 87 years old. And it was for her enormous contribution to children's literature and for basically creating a whole new genre of children's book. A historical fiction novel. And really that category of children's literature had not existed before Laura started writing her family story in 1932. The stories in the Little House books were all from her life or her husband Almanzo's life. And there is a basic truth and historical accuracy to the books, but not every detail of the books is a true event from her life.
Some people are composites. Some things she took stories from friends or
adjusted their ages slightly to make
an appropriate story.
Or in one case, she left out the fact that they had another child in the family, and he died during a terribly hard time, and so she didn't want that in a children's book. It's too sad. And so she just left out that whole year. So it's a truthful story of her life without being a true every single detail story.
Yeah, it's not a complete autobiography. So what exactly are the reasons and so on? I mean, it's where there's talking racism, but this has been around a long time.
So the book...
Kids have been reading it. So.
The book award was just for the contribution to children's literature, and she was told when it was given to her that it would be awarded periodically, forever, to someone who had made a great contribution.
Probably the guy that wrote The Giving Tree and so on, stuff like that.
Well, I don't know who all of the recipients have been, but it has been going on all this while. And at this point in time, they've decided that they've been deliberating since February. And the American Library Association has decided that she no longer represents
their current value system or whatever.
That because of the portrayal of Native American and black people in her books. Well, you are hard-pressed to find the depiction of a black person in her book. She was born in Wisconsin. She was born in Wisconsin and then lived out in the prairie where they hardly had any neighbors, and so there was an occasion to have a large exposure to black people. The one that I can recall from the whole series of books was the doctor named Dr. George Tan, who she mentions by name. And
this is the one that brought them through malaria, and was the first black person she ever saw. That
yes,
pretty much came to seeing this person. I remembered seeing a black hand helping her back when she was sick. Yes. So I remember that was a very positive. The guy's a doctor, And
he is actually the most educated person in the whole series of books. He's depicted in the illustrations. Well, and it's not a revisionist
thing. That person actually did help.
He was actually a real historical person who did exist. He's one of the absolutely accurate portrayals. And he had been born in Pennsylvania and was hired by the government as a doctor for the Osage Indians. And so
so that's what he was doing on a reservation.
That's why he was there. And he was dressed formally in the illustrations, whereas they're always just, in their casual work clothes unless they're going to something very special. They only have one fancy outfit.
Yeah.
Anyhow, so I don't know how you could object to his portrayal. He was portrayed as kind and jovial and friendly with the father.
She said something about,
although
I might have been afraid of him if I didn't love him so much, or something, something like that. I don't remember. It's been ages.
It was. She did say that she came to and there he was, and he was so very black. He was so very black that she would have been afraid of him if she didn't like him so much.
That is awful.
And he smiled at her with all of his white teeth. But you got to remember, she was a 7-year-old girl who'd never seen a black man before. And in her real life, she was even younger.
Okay.
So it's a very babyish memory. And
yeah, the people would have to be reading a whole lot into that. Oh my God, she fears the black man. But
he sat and visited with her father, and
so they were in
enjoyed
an accommodating
each
house. It's not like it was.
They
it's
enjoyed
not like
each
they
other's
hated
company.
anyone.
And the man saved the lives of a whole slew of the neighbors as well. He's the hero of the book. So for somebody who wrote that particular book was 1935. That's a very positive portrayal.
Yeah. So, what about? I have no idea what it even says about American Indians in those.
Well, in Little House on the Prairie, they were actually trespassing on Indian land. They were in Indian territory. What they had done is gone in advance of the land being opened by the U.S. government for settlement. Now, I don't agree with the way they handled that entire thing in the government, but they had gotten information that by the time they got there, that it would be open for settlement or about to be open for settlement.
Yeah,
they
so they're just getting there.
To get there and choose their prime land. They arrived and set up their little house, and there's no communication coming to them, so they're assuming that it's okay to be here by now because that goes with the information they've been given. They built their house right on the trail.
right out of Indian.
Yes. They arrived when the Indians were away on an extended hunt, and then realized that their house was right on the trail that the Indians used.
Oh, I bet that wasn't a great reception. Does it say anything about that?
Well, the Indians had actually been told by the government that they could, this is not in the book, this is just true, that they could charge rent to any white people who settled on their land because this was their land.
Oh, so they had to barter off a bunch of stuff, didn't they?
It was a diminished reserve that they'd been concentrated to, and now here are these white people here. And so they had the right to charge them rent. Well, the Ingalls didn't know this. This isn't in their books. But all of a sudden, Indians would appear and demand some food or some tobacco or something or other because they know that they're able to charge rent. And
they, basically, it's not going to be a set amount every month. That's not even a concept yet.
No, it's not. It's not a Native American philosophy.
Yeah.
They shared with people, and
so now they had people on their land, and they would share back.
And
that makes good sense.
This was an affront to Ma because they had very little to work with, and here they are in the middle of nowhere with their meager supplies, and you've got guests that you didn't ask for that think you're going to feed them whenever.
Yeah. Actually, the whole guests that you didn't ask for and what constituted courtesy back then was way different anyway. It's like, oh, you're passing through, could you feed the pigs and water this and do everything else? It's like, wow, okay.
Well,
you were required to give bread and water, weren't you, if somebody was traveling through? I can't remember.
Well, you weren't necessarily required, but it was normal because it was a matter of life and death, really. It could be if it wasn't at that time. And, a lot of the people, like McLaughlin Boulevard, that's a person who just had a house here before anybody else did, and as the settlers came through, they stayed there and rested. It's just what happened.
Yeah.
Well, Ma, her experience was that she had come from Wisconsin near the Minnesota border, and in 1862 there was a true massacre there.
Part of the Indian Wars?
In Minnesota, part of the Indian Wars, and the Indians had massacred a bunch of settlers.
I'll bet it went both ways, but in any case.
I'm sure that it did go both ways, but the point is that this group of people had all come from this area. So she had known of people who were greatly affected by this massacre, which is the way they saw it. It's not mine.
Yeah, well, people died, so you're going to see it.
And so they also had neighbors in the book called Mr. and Mrs. Scott. And Mr. and Mrs. Scott had been in the community that was victim to this.
Yeah.
And so they come with extreme prejudice against Indians, although they're on Indian land, in Indian territory, which they...
And realizing they better... do they have any concept?
Well, Mrs. Scott actually said that Laura remembered the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And she writes that in her book. But
she writes that in her book?
She
like an autobiography or a kid's book?
No. Laura Ingalls writes that in her book, that Mrs. Scott made this statement.
Oh, okay.
However, she doesn't say she agrees with that statement. In fact, Pa says that that isn't true, that the Indians would be every bit as peaceable as everyone else if you just left them alone to live their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And so the point is, there's a vast array of views, and she didn't only give a negative one. She gave the one that people that she came in contact with
also were sharing at the time.
Were actually stating at the time. And her father believed in being respectful of them and inviting them in, and he smoked
tobacco
pipe with them, and I believe I remember him playing music for them and treated them well, with respect. And she went even further than that, because what happens in that book is that they have received misinformation. They're not going to open that territory then to settling, and they eventually get a communication from the government that says that they have to leave the land. However, the government also is resettling the Indians further west, and as they're in...
Oh, so they leave the land and then they wind up resettling it anyway? I don't know.
No, they have, before they leave the land, the Native Americans are evicted from the land as well. Don't know the reason for that.
Okay, well, I guess it's right there.
But when she's describing the departure, it's like they're going to be missing something that was a integral part of the landscape. You know, it's and how she writes about the departure, but then the very last pony went by, but Pa and Ma and Mary still stayed in the doorway looking until that long line of Indians slowly pulled itself over the western edge of the world, and nothing was left but silence and emptiness, and all the world seemed very quiet and lonely. Now,
and then they decided to pull her book award because she's a racist or something.
Now, that's not a statement written by a racist person. That's a statement that thought, well, she even asked her father why are we going to the Indians' territory? Won't the Indians be? And he cut her off. And, you know, she was a little girl that didn't understand, if that's their home, why are we here?
Yeah.
And she describes them always in that book. What I remember her description being is they're wild and free, and she wishes she could be. She always was a very good little girl who was very wishing that she could be.
Well, but Ma is saying they smell like bear grease because they use it to keep warm.
Well, they used it in their hair, and she didn't like how the Indians smelled. I see
what reason why a person could take offense to things, but the thing is that they were the realities of the time. And I'm not saying the racist views are something that are acceptable at the time. But saying that somebody smelled like bear grease when they smelled like bear grease, or
whatever
the situation, I just don't know.
Ma was certainly prejudiced against Indians. There is not really
shred
a
of evidence
valid
the other way. Right?
Yeah, she didn't enjoy having them in her home, and she was afraid of them. And the dog would bark, and she didn't blame him. Although Pa taught the dog not to bark because it was their bath. But the thing is, how in the world can you learn from history if you try to erase everything that was negatively said in history? Because you have to learn what wasn't true that was said besides what was true.
You don't want people looking at it and thinking that Laura Ingalls was a tyrannical matriarch who hated black people and Native Americans, or that was even generally the view of many people at the time.
I think truly that she was using, well, for one thing, she was calling them Indians all the time. We don't do that anymore.
No.
I do, because I was raised calling Indians, but try to say Native American because it's what they would want. And she was from 1932 and 64 years old when she was writing these books. And so, well, she started the books in 32. That particular one where they were in Kansas was 1935. But the point is,
I think it's crazy that you know all this. I haven't even read one of these books since I was a kid, and you probably before that, at least around that time.
No, I read them when I was little. But I reread them to you guys, and I also thought of them as I loved that idea that you could pull up to a piece of open land and just think, oh, this is the one for me.
Yeah, that's where I put the garden, that's where I put the house, and so on. Yeah, it's a romantic idea.
It's a lovely idea, and I thought I loved how self-sufficient they were, and so I liked to try and learn how to do the things that they were doing. And I think that those books are extremely educational for that kind of a reason. And we've cooked tons of their recipes and
in the wood cook stove.
Yes, but I think that she presented various people's views for a reason. I think that she put Mrs. Scott's views, though they were distasteful, even to her and her father, and
as something to not emulate, because this is the positive view of the father and so on.
Well, yes, or something to talk about, to think, well, why did you think that was wrong, and who did you agree with more? And they're educational books, truly. There's a lot of life lessons in those books. And the Indians did treat them with respect because they were treated with respect. So even though they were intruders, they were accepted intruders who were treated well. And I think that she told the whole story so that people could learn acceptance from it.
I absolutely agree. That was my impression. And I don't remember the show at all, but in any case.
Well, the show was
With
not
different people and so on.
well. The show was not totally based on the books. The books are an adaptation of her life, and the shows were an adaptation of the books, which then hired scriptwriters who wrote something that went with this kind of theme, and so it gets farther and farther from what was real.
It was an all right old show. Anyway.
But the books are special because Laura Ingalls was a person with huge integrity, and she was not a vain person at all, and she really was not wanting any attention for herself. But
well, and she's not endorsing oppression.
No. and she even the book award, she didn't go in person to accept it. She wrote them a letter thanking them very much and said that she was really very pleased, but that at her age, that her health was such that she didn't think that she should travel, and then she sent her daughter a letter where she sent her a copy of The Wire, and that was her celebration for for winning this grand award. And but I don't think it's right, because it really was an honor to her to strip her name from it.
Well, and it really is revisionist. I don't even understand what is the positive good that comes from stripping an honor of a dead woman who is honorable, or even who might have offended somebody, and who cares?
Well, we have all kinds of people who lived long ago who did things that we don't do now, or said things that we'd never say now, that still made a
positive,
great,
lasting impression.
Yes. And if you eradicate their achievements, you're losing something. And if you are accepting them as they were and talking about it, you're doing more to erase a negative impression than if you just erase what you didn't like.
Yeah.
I think.
Well, I guess we'll leave it there. The whole thing is just so ridiculous.
Well, I think it's sad. I mean, their books aren't being taken out of libraries at the moment. But
they have been in the past.
But
they banned her in 93 or so, 90 something.
In little areas of the country, they have banned her, and then they have put her back. One thing I didn't think to mention, because it never stuck out to me as much, was that there was also a series of entertainment evenings. There was a series of entertainment evenings when they lived in Walnut Grove. And the town put together an evening's entertainment. And at one of those, they decided to have a minstrel show. And Pa wore blackface. And Laura was unaware that he was going to do it. So she was surprisedly watching the show, and when he played the fiddle, was shocked to notice that it was actually Pa. And
so blackface, which is
and that
was different at that time.
And obviously, no one would be doing that now. But you have to realize that it was in the 1870s, and possibly about 1880, and that was big deal entertainment at that point. That was the hot thing to do. It was cutting edge, and they didn't have the same sensitivities that they've got now. And she's telling about a different time, and so that was a very brief thing in a book, one book in a series of books.